Now are Lucy Thomas, who's Deputy Director of Britain Stronger in Europe and is now Head of Brexit Advice at the PR firm Edelman, and Henry Newman, the Director of Open Europe. Welcome to both of you. So, have you finally got it, Henry Newman? Is this the case that Britain has finally woken up to the fact that they do need to be a little more open-minded and a little more emollient if they're going to get something back?
I think what we saw in the Prime Minister's speech at Florence was a sort of grown-up consensus. She changed her tone. She puts quite a lot of things on the table. But my concern is I don't think Europe is getting it. I think that Mr Barnier is pretending that this is some sort of technical exercise to get to an assessment of whether we made sufficient progress. But reality is he's basically doing this, putting his finger in the air, making a political judgment. And I think if you take a reasonable view of what the UK have proposed, they've put quite a lot on the table now. It's time to move on and start talking about the future. Right.
I mean, isn't that the case? The money's there now. In the terms that the figures have been put on the table, it's time to just negotiate a final figure. There's obviously goodwill on both sides in terms of settling the EU citizens question. They need to sort out the final arbiter, of course, who is going to ensure those rights. And actually, when it comes to the border in Northern Ireland, that cannot be sorted until you can look at a free trade deal. So isn't Henry Newman right? EU is blocking this.
I think ultimately it's about leverage, and both sides are looking at what cards do we have on our side. For the UK, it's trade and security, broadly speaking. For the EU, it's the ability to move on to the second stage. But they also want to make sure that there is enough in that budget pot. And for the UK to say we're going to pay the bare minimum, which is to cover our liabilities for the 2 years, 2019-2020, that is not enough for the EU.
Well, they have said more than that, I think.
And would they? And how much more should they pay? And would that push the talks further along?
I think they said two things. I think they said that during the current budgetary period, no country will have to pay more or receive less. But they've also said that they'll meet their obligations from the past. That's sort of two separate commitments. I mean, I think the key is both sides here have a profound moral duty, right? The UK is exercising a democratic decision that is allowed in the treaties. Right, and I think that decision has to be respected, and the EU has a duty to come to the table seriously and take these negotiations properly.
Isn't the problem, though, as you said, a political one, that actually here in the UK, Theresa May's position is weaker than it was before the election, and they recognise that in Brussels, that there is a difference of opinion that has been playing out here on the political stage with Boris Johnson's 4,000-word opus on what he thinks should happen in these Brexit negotiations. Philip Hammond has a slightly different view and would like to see us more closely aligned to the single market. That's what makes it difficult.
I don't think so. I think that you've got disagreement in the cabinet, you've got disagreement in politics. This is a very profound issue which we should all be debating and discussing. But actually, the government, the Conservative Party, are pretty united around the Lancaster House speech position, which stayed the same at Florence. We'll be leaving the single market, we'll be leaving the customs union. The new bit is we'll have a transition, which is broadly a standstill for 2 years.
Do you think it's too rigid? The problem for Michel Barnier is he is dictated to by the Commission and the 27 other member states, and that rigid formula is now becoming a barrier.
Well, this was always going to be the way it was going to be, and for the likes of me, one of the reasons I thought leaving was a really bad idea, because there are 27 countries on that side, all being negotiated through this one-person Barnier. So it means he doesn't have flexibility. The 27 set him a mandate at the beginning of the process and said, here you go away, this is what you need to do on our behalf. And so we can't pick off different countries, we can't go over their heads. He has to be flexible. And I think the point on top of the bill is this ECJ point. For the EU and for Barnier, they want there to be oversight of the European Court of Justice because, frankly, they don't trust us.
Right. I mean,
well, I think that's slightly. I think agree that is a concern on the continent, but I think anybody with any experience of the UK court system would find it hard to recognise a view that they're somehow biased in a political direction. I think our courts are more than capable of defending citizens' rights, and the commitment today from the government to put the withdrawal treaty into domestic law is exactly the right one.
And that's a move. That is a guarantee, if you like, isn't it, to EU citizens to write it in law. You can understand why people would be nervous about their future status because governments come and go. So that guarantee, should that not be enough now?
Well, I think on paper perhaps, but if you look at what Barnier has said before, he raised, in his speech the day before Theresa May's speech, he raised the fact that the UK government had ignored the courts on one of these issues. So he is being very political. He's a long-standing politician who wants to play tactics with this.
The classic thing when I listen to it, and I'm not making a discourse here, you just argued why the UK courts should be trusted and they're unbiased, which I think they are, and I think they're very good. Equally, the ECJ has a very strong reputation too as being one of the gold standard of legal decision making in the world. So the problem is the argument that you've used why it should be the UK court has exactly a flip point as why it should be a European court. And that's the problem with this negotiation. We are used to a political party in power making a decision and an opposition who object to it and can only touch around the edges. Here we're in a true negotiation of the most difficult type. And what we're seeing, you know, in the debate that went before the Brexit vote was, you know, we wouldn't have gone into this in the first place, so we should get out of it. But marriage and divorce are not the same things. And this is going to be, as we're seeing already, a very, very difficult divorce negotiation. We just have to cross our fingers. Britain gets what it wants. We work together to try and make sure that our economy stays stable and we thrive on the back end of it. But I think it's going to be tough.
And on the basis of that, do you think the transition period of 2 years or something around that sort of point is about right in order to help that transition through?
Yeah, I've long felt that a transition was pretty inevitable. I think the idea of keeping things where they are is a good thing. It'll sort of reassure businesses, it'll reassure people who voted for Remain, and it'll mean, as Davis said, there's only one sort of change that business has to make rather than two, rather than one into a transition period and one out of a transition period.
But there would still be a cliff edge.
Well, I mean, there will be a change in regulatory landscape, and that's what we haven't yet answered. That's what the Cabinet needs to determine.
Right, and of course that still, as you say, has yet to be worked out. I mean, if you are looking at where the government has gone now in terms of that transition, would you accept that they've sort of bought Labour's proposal on this?
No, I don't. I think Labour's position is unclear, actually. And I tried to challenge Keir Starmer at an event that Open Europe held at party conference on this. They are saying that they want to be in the single market. Well, what does that mean? How are you in the single market if you're not in the EU itself or in the European Economic Area? I don't know, and I don't think they know.
Right, and do you accept that Labour's trying to face both ways on this? And they could argue that in opposition, that's what you do. We can promise Leavers that we're doing what they wanted, and the same with Remainers. I mean, they're even now talking about a second referendum again.
I think the main problem Labour faces is the broad spectrum of opinion that exists within it, both within MPs and constituencies. A majority of their constituencies voted to leave in the referendum, but a majority of their voters voted to remain. So they have this real challenge, and you've got people like Sadiq Khan, as you say, calling for the possibility of a second referendum, and then you have those more like John McDonnell and Corbyn himself, who think that single market membership is incompatible with the kind of nationalisation they want to carry out, which in fact isn't correct. And I think they need to understand what is possible within the single market. But nevertheless, that there is that broad spectrum to really come to a position on.
Finally, Liam Fox has launched this new think tank looking at free trade. He obviously hasn't got much to do at the moment, has he? Because they can't talk about free trade deals.
Not fair, really.
Well, sorry, I mean, I don't mean that he's not doing anything, but, you know, in terms of the role that he's been given, there isn't that much to do while they have to wait.
I think he's got to look at the existing free trade deals that the UK has as a membership through its membership of the EU and try to grandfather those across once we're out.
So how would you deal with the Boeing Bombardier dispute that we are now in the middle of? I mean, if it's going to be a great sort of panacea, this idea of striking up free trade deals, here we are coming up against a problem of protectionism.
Sure, and I think that does need to be resolved, and it's a question between Bombardier, the Canada and the US, and the UK, obviously, Northern Ireland in particular, is exposed to this, and we need to try and find a political solution.
All right, thank you to both of you.
Thank you.